this new, it's sort of like the circus, right? There'll be Christians and lions in the middle.
Are you the tiger?
Yeah. Welcome to this final Fundamentals forum. I'm, for people that don't know me, I'm the graduate chair. I'm very happy to host faculty members and colleagues for discussions, which I think have been very successful on the three distinct themes that we're pursuing in this grad seminar on fundamentals of architecture. The first forum was on precedent, that is fundamentals in history. The second was on fundamentals in theory, and the last one will be on fundamentals and politics. This has been generated by the Biennale, which I think runs till November, curated by Almost, on fundamentals and elements of architecture, a return to the basics. So this is folded in our seminar, which is very reading intensive, and which also will include workshops in the spring. So tonight we have on the left corner, we have Professor Laurie Brown as a speaker, and Professor Yutaka Sho on the right. And we have as respondents on the opposite side, Professor Liz Kamell and Professor Lawrence Chua. So, welcome and let the games begin.
Thank you.
So as neither Christian nor lion, I stand slightly off center. So I'm charged with kind of setting up our discussion this evening, and I thought I'd begin by very briefly kind of tracing out, by very briefly giving you guys a definition of politics, and then tracing out a sort of brief history of the theme of architecture and politics. So the first is pretty easy. Politics is essentially the business of government, that it's the control and management of the people living in a society. So it's how people provide for their mutual security, how they establish sustainable terms of social cooperation. Politics is that thing that people do instead of killing each other. And what's unique about political science or government as an academic discipline is that it's a discipline that operates in the public realm. So the history of political thought, at least in the West, where we all are, is inseparable from the history of the classical Greek polis. And we might trace our definition of politics back to Plato's Republic. So this is a work that's written as a Socratic dialogue in the late 4th century BCE. And Plato is concerned with the definition of justice and the order and character of the just city-state and its citizens. So in Book 6, he has Socrates argue that the just ruler of a city is a true philosopher who understands forms, and that this philosopher of forms is able to somehow facilitate the harmonious cooperation of all the citizens of the polis. I don't think that Plato quite means forms in the way that we understand forms in a school of architecture, or even philosophy is the way that we might think of philosophy here and now. But he is bringing these things together for us, right? He's bringing together thinking, he's bringing together forms, and he's bringing together politics within the space of the polis. So this is my definition of politics. So for the readings that I submitted to the seminar, there were 4 readings that I hope you managed to get through. The first reading was a brief extract of something that Christopher Wren wrote, or that Christopher Wren and his family wrote, and this is from about the 17th century. So what Wren writes in this kind of biography is that public buildings are the ornament of the country. And he says that the emulation of the cities of Greece really had to do with the physical character of those cities. He says that the love of the Jews for the Temple of Solomon was this kind of constituent glue that holds them together as a community. And writing in the 17th century, he hasn't quite worked out how this happens. Like, why is architecture somehow politically persuasive to the citizens of these cities? And we should remember this is like several centuries before Benjamin writes his essay about aesthetics and politics. But Wren suggests that this power of architecture to influence people has something to do with beauty, and specifically it has something to do with perspective. So he's privileging sight above the other senses. But basically what he's saying is that architecture has political import because it makes us feel something. So this is the 17th century. The second reading that I asked you guys to read was from Manfredo Tafori, and this is several hundreds of years later, the 1970s. It's from a book called The Sphere and the Labyrinth, and it's the introduction to this book. And in this introduction, I don't know if you noticed, it was kind of buried between paragraphs, but he says, architecture as politics is now such an exhausted myth that it is pointless to waste any more words on it. So he's kind of saying, this is not an important issue anymore. Why are we even discussing this? And Tafori is probably notorious to all of you because he's one of the first modern architectural historians to adopt a very clearly Marxist perspective. And what he argues is that architecture is unable to become a tool for social transformation. And remember, he's writing in the 70s. So what Tafori is saying is that the best that we can hope for is a critical analysis of architecture. And that analysis can be accomplished through history. Go history. This critical history is not object-based. So he's not concerned as an architectural historian with individual monuments or even architects, but with architecture writ large, architecture as an institution. And he argues that a critical history concerns the cycles of architectural activity and the problem of how a work of architecture fits in its own time. How is architecture relevant to the moment in which it's created? And his approach, which he calls the progresso storio, wants to study the totality of a work of architecture, meaning its iconology, its philosophy, its political economy, its science, and its folklore. So what Tafori is saying is that architecture can't change society, but that a critical history of architecture might be able to transform society. And then I asked you to fast forward again to a reading by David Harvey, who's not an architect or an architectural historian, but is a geographer. And he's writing in the early noughts. And he also uses Marx, but he uses Marx to pose another role for the architect. And he's really developing this chapter that I asked you to read based on a very famous quote in Marx's Capital. And this quote is should be interesting to us because it's one of the few times that Marx actually mentions the architect. And he compares the architect to bees. And he says that architects are smarter than bees. That even though both bees and architects build things, that architects can imagine the structures that they build before they build them. And Harvey kind of seizes on this quote and reasons that this act of imagination, which is so central to capitalism, right? Which, if you think of capitalism as this this economic system, this economic philosophy that has to imagine its ventures before they're realized in the market. And the ways that capitalism is really sort of amazing as a social system because it mobilizes these multiple imaginaries, not just the imagination of one person or even one class, but the imagination of entrepreneurs, financiers, developers, architects, planners, bureaucracies, as well as laborers. So what Harvey is saying is that this free reign of the imagination, which is fundamental to the perpetuation of capitalism, is also the space in which an alternative imaginary can grow, that it's in that space that we might imagine what a future outside of capitalism might look like. And Harvey is saying that there's in fact something very valuable about utopian thinking, which is something that I think permeates all facets of architectural education, that it's I think many educators are well aware that you don't find the kind of optimists in any other discipline that you find in a school of architecture. And Harvey is saying that there's something very valuable about this, that in spite of Marx's critique of utopianism, that there's something valuable about the ability of the architect to, quote, do architecture, because architects perform in this very elaborate dance with power, with capital, with regulations, with developers, with clients' preferences. So what Harvey is saying is that architecture can change society because it's produced out of the same complex matrix as capitalist society itself. And the question that this really begs is, what then might the ethics of the profession be in this kind of dance that he's sketching out for us? The fourth reading that I put before you was by an architect, by L. Wiseman, and it's from this year. And Wiseman, who's probably familiar to not a few of you, argues for a forensic architecture. So Wiseman wants to return us to the idea of the forum, this public forum, as part of the etymology of the term forensic. And he's really underscoring these public qualities of forensics. Wiseman defines politics as driven by a desire to change the way that things are. So this is very much an activist understanding of the political and of architectural history and practice. What Wiseman is saying is that buildings are not passive scenes of crime, but they're these composite assemblies of structure, spaces, infrastructure, services, and technologies that can interact with their surroundings and somehow shape the events around them. That architecture structures and conditions rather than simply frames human actions. That architecture shapes incidents and events. And this is a very fine distinction between a kind of view of architecture in the 1970s, that he's not adopting this kind of 1970s sociological perspective that if you build something, then somehow it will shape the behavior of the people that come and inhabit it. This is something else. That what he's saying is that spaces shape history, and this is his provocation. So this is the definition of politics. This is the historical background to our discussion tonight. And I wanted to, before I cede the floor to my colleagues, I wanted to suggest something about the topic of our conversation today. So our topic is architecture and politics, and what I'd like to suggest is what might happen if we remove one of the words from this equation. What might happen if we remove the word and think instead of architecture as really its own political arrangement. And doing so, for me, I think, creates a different way of understanding REM's Fundamentals project, or at least the collection of booklets that has been available for us to read. That it seems to me that one of the potentials of this project, of the Fundamentals project, is to allow us to focus on those aspects of the built environment that remain largely invisible to other disciplines, that other disciplines are constantly trying to figure out what is it that architecture does? What is architecture? And by looking at these elements, like these fundamental elements, like staircase, roof, or my favorite, toilet, that it allows us to consider their political import. That, you know, if you think about it, architecture has this incredibly rich language, that it's able to describe every detail of the atrium in which we're sitting, and to describe the ways that the component fundamental pieces of the space fit together and are ordered. But what architecture lacks is a language to describe the opportunities for political organization and action that these spaces open up for us. That, in short, what architecture lacks is a language to describe the ways that it can both facilitate and impede social progress. Just some things to think about as we go into the meat of tonight's event. And I'll turn it over to Professor Sho.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes. Thank you, Lawrence. That was a perfect introduction. My talk will be very related to what you just said. One of the readings that I've asked you guys to read was by Foucault, What is Critique? I'm putting these images up there because I want to talk about not government, but governance, what governs us. And today, I want to talk about images that govern us, how our images that are shaped by these views that we get, especially about Africa, shape our government policies, economic investment policies, how powerful they are and how we are governed by those images, and how architecture may start to intervene in that governance and join in the governance so that we govern together. And I want to start with specifics and then go wider. I want to talk about what I know and not make stuff up. Okay, so I put these up because I imagine that, you know, Africa is under discussed but overrepresented. There are three types of images of Africa that I'm thinking of right now. One is, these two are by both David Adjaye, one of the most famous African architects in the West. On the left, those are the images from his exhibition, Modern Africa, Urban Africa, where he took pictures of modern architecture in Africa. I imagine he was going for the wow effect. Oh, we thought Africa was really poor and violent, and there's all these poverty and starvation, but you have modern buildings too. Good for you. And there's some, you know, anxiety eminent from it. We are okay too, right? And then on the right-hand side is also the underwear designed by David Adjaye. And if you buy a pair, people would plant 20 trees so that the West is going to help. Africa is always needing help. We save them, we help them, we nurture them. Therefore, we are good people. We treat them like children because they haven't developed yet. And the third type of image, I didn't put it up there on purpose because they're the violence and the starvation and the stereotypical poor Africans. So those three types of images shape our investment policies because we have to help them, and it helps us to feel good about ourselves, and the West will be always the developed ones and Africa will not be. White? Okay, I can do that. Okay. It's okay, Lauren, I can do that. Who has the little thing on this side? Lori does. Anthropologist James Scott stated that the purpose of the state and their policies is to organize the previously unorganized field through implementation of policies such as taxations, land tenure, census, and ID, so that the state can see where the citizens are, therefore they can control them. Therefore he called it seeing like a state. So his assumption is that the society is inherently disorganized and chaotic, and it needs to be understood by visualizing. Ooh. But then James Ferguson says, no, no, no. The field is not disorganized, and the purpose of having a state is not to make the state run efficiently, but to make the state look like they're efficient. Okay, double-fisted now. I didn't say that, sorry. Oh, wow. Okay, so, so Africa, or any kind of developing countries, they are not interested in actually organizing the field or going toward efficiency and modernization, but simply to look like it's a state that is modern, therefore appeal to the donors and the NGOs and investment bankers to invite them to invest into their development projects. So they just want to put all the hands they can to put into as many projects as possible so they can control it, but they're not really interested in being efficient. And I'm gonna go this way, okay. Oh, that one. And then, oh, not that one. Oh, that one's wrong, sorry. So look at this one. So in Rwanda where I work, that is very prominent because the policies, there's so many policies after the genocide, and I didn't even put up all the ones that affect architecture. The peachy colors are the policies that affect architecture and urbanism, and they overlap social, economic, social engineering projects. So some of them include you cannot walk barefoot, you have to dry your dishes on the tables, not on the grass. So everything that they want, it goes into policies. So it has nothing to do with efficiency, it has everything to do with looking like a modern state. And 50% of the Rwandan federal budget is based on international funding, so it's understandable. There's a very clear and direct consequences to their looks, modern looks, directly connecting to the development project. Why? Oh. Yeah, please, thank you. No, it's okay. And some of the modern projects look like this in urban areas. There. OZ Architects created the urban master plan for the city of Kigali, which is the capital of Rwanda. They're from Colorado. And the individual master plans for districts are created by Surbana from Singapore, and some of the projects that took up, so Rwanda just sold a $40 million bond to European investors. 5/8 of that money is going into this conference center, which is built by the Chinese contractors. So a lot of money, a lot of decisions are paid to and made by foreign global powers right now. And also in the rural areas, there's a policy going on to move every single citizen into a planned village like this on the right-hand side, built by Chinese. And the rich people would build houses like the one on the left, which I don't know if you can see, the roof is bigger than the house itself, and that roof is completely empty. It's a one-story building, but they want to make it look like a Western house, even though it doesn't snow there. So the look is sort of a, but if you understand that the look directly connects to investment and being treated like the West, therefore respected, and being treated not like a savage or poor or people who need help, then this architecture becomes the demand to us. The audience is us, and they're demanding that I understand it as a demand to treat them like equals. So, but nonetheless, they are ruled by that modern aesthetics. They're ruled by the economy and the politics. And these two projects, one is mine and the other one is my mentor, Dr. Sasaki. They, I hope, try to be non-governmental. And non-governmental doesn't really mean that lack of government. It doesn't mean anarchism, but it means to challenge, critique, but also join in and become a partner of governance, so that you take on part of the responsibility in governing ourselves, but we don't simply criticize and then leave the scene. So the one on the left, the guy in the Obama shirt and the guy in the purple jacket, those are genocidaires who served their sentences. But after they came back from working for the government, building houses and roads for the state, they came back and started a non-governmental organization that builds homes for the survivors of the genocide. You can see the house they are building in the background. So the workshop was organized to reconciliate between the survivors and the offenders. And at the end of the workshop, they build houses, so that architecture gives a space and time for reconstruction and define what peace could mean. Because when we talk about peace, we are also talking in its negation, a lack of war, absence of violence, no hostility. But we don't have the positive definition of peace. And if we don't have that, we can't make it. So in this particular project, they're making it in the form of a house, but the house is still modern. It's square with iron sheeting and square windows, and it's not thatch because the government banned it. So in a way, the architecture is still governed by the West, but the way they're building it is different. In our project, we don't deal with the genocidaires at all, but in a much smaller scale, we are trying to organize the workers that we hire, and they create their own builders association and try to be independent economically, socially, and politically. So we, as a group, agreed to put forth a manifesto and then leave with a question. So here's my manifesto for the night. I'm sure it'll change tomorrow, but so for me, architecture is one of the means. I don't think it functions alone. One of the means to make art of not being governed, and that's a quote from the same reading by Foucault. So that we can join in the act of governance, not to reject governance, but to point fingers and say, we don't want to be governed like this, but we can do it together somehow. Then my question is, how's business? One of the things that's governing our project a lot is the capitalism and the way we build. Because of the way the business is set up in architecture, we can only build for clients who have money. And in my business, my clients have zero money. And if that's the only way that we can actualize spaces that are productive for people who need it the most, then we can't do it. So now that perhaps capitalism is dying, if we can imagine different ways of running our business, how can we do it? Who should pay for architecture? Because if we don't, then this is what we end up with. Most of our projects in so-called developing countries, it's the second best from the West, and we give it to them because that's all they can afford. Therefore, the message we are sending is, please enjoy your poverty. And you're stuck with this, but too bad because you can't afford it otherwise. So this is an amazing critique, I think, toward architecture. Thank you.
There's one before it, though. Can you back one? Maybe oh, okay, so there we go.
All right. So I decided tonight to give my talk as a manifesto in 5 parts. But I first would like to contextualize the work I do and the influences that are important for my work. I think as spatial producers, we all have the ability to organize space and to hopefully influence and change society. And I want to look at 2 philosophers and 1 cultural critic very quickly as a way to set up the work I'm going to show you and my manifesto. The first is the philosopher Elizabeth Gross. And she asked us, how do we think architecture differently? How to think in architecture without conforming to the standards of architecture. Insofar as architecture seeking not so much innovation, not simply the latest fad, but to produce differently, to engender the new, to risk creating otherwise, how to keep architecture open to its outside, how to force architecture to think. The other person, one of the other people, is the architectural and cultural critic Rainer Banham. And in his essay, A Black Box, he criticizes architecture for its entrenchment within itself and the solipsism the discipline instills and perpetuates at the very beginning of our architectural education, especially with the design studio pedagogy and culture. As he states, the discipline operates on such a narrow value system with unspoken or unspeakable assumptions on which it rests. Architecture no longer acknowledges, is no longer acknowledged as the dominant mode of rational design. It is seen as the exercise of an arcane and privileged aesthetic code. He goes even further, lambasting architecture as too proud and too accepting of a parochial rulebook that can only seem to be a crippling limitation on buildings' power to serve humanity. However, he ends the essay with a glimmer of hope that if architecture would allow itself to be opened up to the understandings of the profane and the vulgar, at the risk of destroying itself as an art in the process, architecture may find an engaged existence in the world. And for me, that's precisely what I aim to do, is to try to bring architecture out to the general public and to engage the general population. I am a feminist, I am an architect, and I am an activist. I use feminist methods both to seek power disruptions as well as to reveal power inequalities. I question architectural universal knowledge and who produces this knowledge. Feminist methods contribute through contextualizing and repoliticizing knowledge and knowledge production. The philosopher Sandra Harding has written that these broader definitions of feminist research and methodology remind us that it's not only the research questions asked, but also those that are not asked that become influential in understanding the larger research potential. As well, she articulates one important component of feminist research is that it is generated from the experiences of women. These experiences are critical for the larger concerns of social life in general. For women should have an equal say in the design and administration of the institutions where knowledge is produced and distributed for reasons of social justice. We are all products of our own environment. What we do shapes and constrains what we know. So I'm going to start with one of my favorite artists, Ai Weiwei, and I love this quote. My favorite word is act. And I see, for me, the connection between politics is action, or between politics, architecture is action. So how can we, as spatial producers, act out in the world? And so in my manifesto, I have 5 actions that I want to share with you. And the first one is nothing is neutral, everything is political. And I'm going to start with a project by Ai Weiwei, which is his study of in perspective of Tiananmen Square in 1995. He flicks off the position of power in Beijing, which is right before the Forbidden City. He, over a 10-year period, goes to other institutions of power, such as the White House, the Reichstag, and also social representations of power, so the Mona Lisa, and photographs himself giving the finger in front of each of these. So I think in terms of how you confront and question representations, both physically and otherwise of power, I find it an interesting proposition. The other project I want to highlight from him is Straight, which was from 2008 to 2012. In response to the 2008 Sichuan earthquake, he was incredibly distraught at the lack of the Chinese government's intervention, and so went as a political citizen to try and find out how many children had actually been killed when the structural systems of the buildings failed in the earthquake. And what he did over a series of many years was eventually recover over 150 tons of steel that had been completely deformed and had it re-straightened as both an element of sculpture that gets reproduced throughout the world in different museums, but also as a critique of the lack of political oversight and what happens when certain governmental institutions fail the people that they're supposed to actually engage. The second point is engage more broadly. And I want to highlight a group that I co-started with Nina Friedman, who's been the director of projects at Sugar Oban. We started this group, Architects, in New York City 2 years ago, as a way to begin to bridge between the academy and practice. We're very interested in raising awareness about the level and role of women throughout all aspects of the architectural community. We do this through events, through programming, through mentoring, and through design actions, and I'll highlight a few. This is an image of the Wage Project that we brought as 2 workshops in New York last year. And I think it's kind of surprisingly apropos that this morning in The Guardian there was a report that the CEO of Microsoft, Nadella, was quoted in saying that women working in male-dominated IT industry are told that they should have faith in the system, that they will deliver the appropriate pay, that women shouldn't ask for raises, but they will be given them on their own merit. And that he added this was just good karma and would help a boss realize the employee could be trusted and should have more responsibility. Well, research demonstrates that that is actually not the case. And if we think about, in 1963, John F. Kennedy signed the Equal Pay Act, which was supposed to prohibit arbitrary discrimination against women in the payment of wages. If we fast forward over 50 years, on average, women make 77 cents for every dollar if you are white, 69 cents for every dollar if you are black, and 57 cents for every dollar if you're a Latina woman. So clearly there's a big issue with pay equity and gender equity. And what we did by bringing the Wage Project, both with the workshops, was to educate women about how do you assess your value and how do you then negotiate for that value when you're in the office asking either for a job or for a raise. And consequently, I also helped arrange bringing the Wage Project's college edition to Syracuse last year to the School of Architecture, where we held 2 sessions for students. Another part of Architects is through brown bag lunch series and mentoring drop-in groups. So we're interested to support women at all stages of their careers, as well as fostering connections and mentoring for young women in college. So the goal being to have a brown bag lecture series in every school, architecture school in New York State, The poster on the left is the spring series, and we're still in the fall planning session, which should happen in the next few weeks. And to raise awareness about women and people of color who aren't on the lecture circuit. From the research that I've been cataloging for the last 2 years, there is at least 1/3 of architecture programs in the US have no women as part of their public programming. And there's about 62% have either no women or one woman. So it's critical that we bring more women and people of color into architecture schools to be lecturing about the work they're doing out in the world. The third point is do architecture differently. And I want to highlight Women on Waves and Atelier Van Lieshout, who is the architect and designer who worked with them. In the research for my second book, which was looking at the spaces of abortion clinics, I came across Women on Waves, which was started by Dr. Rebecca Gomertz in 1999. And what it is a very simple idea that she creates a boat that sails to countries where abortion is illegal and docks 12 miles out in international waters. And because she's in international waters, Dutch law prevails. So women are ferried from the host country where it's illegal out 12 miles where they can then receive reproductive health care. It's important to note that the ship and the interior of the ship was designed by an architect/artist, and that it was critical for the identity and the publicity that there was a very well-known designer involved in the practice. And I think it's interesting as a way to think about how does architecture engage a broader audience, how do we use our design skills in things and in spaces that are not necessarily the given. The fourth point is architecture must politically participate to be vital. And I want to highlight, I'm going to show this video, which is part of the research I've been doing. Yeah, it's okay if it's off. This is in front of an abortion clinic in Louisville, Kentucky, where the street every week is lined with people trying to access care. It's lined with protesters, and there's escorts that you'll see coming towards the camera that escort them safely into the building. And as a result of doing this research and of interviewing providers across the country, I came across the remaining clinic in Mississippi. And with the group in New York that I co-lead, we just had a design action to have ideas for that fence. How do we think about that fence as more private, as more secure, and as visually and aesthetically better? Because currently there's black plastic sheeting duct taped across the fence. So what role can design play in the built environment to both raise awareness of what we do, but also to make that experience for both sides of the fence actually better, safer, and work better within the community. The exhibit, there was an exhibit at Parsons and that just closed, and it's going to be traveling to Mississippi next. And the goal is that we design something that will be built within the next year and a half for defense. And the last point I want to make is to take action. And I want to focus this for the students, because I think you have far more agency and have far more power than you realize. And I want to highlight the Change.org petition that I'm sure you're probably all familiar with in terms of trying to recognize Denise Scott Brown for her work with Robert Venturi for the Pritzker Prize that he was solely awarded in 1991. The two women who started this, who had graduated, were architecture students from the GSD. And as a result of hearing Denise Scott Brown give a talk and discussing the issues of she not being equally represented within this prize, they started this petition. There's over 19,000 signatures and still counting. Even just yesterday when I took this shot, people were still signing this petition. And although the Pritzker refused to recognize and accept the change that they were asking for, I think it raises incredible awareness about the role students have within our community and the design community at large, and what you can do if you seek to do it. And I think it's just a really inspiring example of how you can take action. It's not necessarily about building something, but it has impact on the way we think about the built environment and who's getting rewarded as stellar examples of architects for the built environment. And with that, I'll
Thank you, both of you. Well, my role here, I think, is to respond and to kind of collect in some sort of cohesive way all three presentations. There are four, I think, kind of subjects or ways of thinking about all of the talks that I think are ultimately very relevant. One of them has to do, getting back to the very beginning, that has to do with the construction of the just city-state and Plato's understanding of what that might be. And I think it has a lot to do with ethics and morals. Ethics having to do with kind of societal constraints imposed, and then a morality that might be more personal and a way of interacting with a kind of larger ethical code or construct, and they overlap. I thought that Yutaka's talk was really interesting in that respect. What is it? How do we act as in our own as professionals in relation to our own kind of sense of what is right and what might not be right. And as a part of that, I think I would ask, is it really possible to construct an ethical code for the profession, or whether that becomes impossible in a kind of global way, because I think in some ways that is much more, it is local. It's cultural, it's specific, and it's difficult to, I think, apply a kind of large or global professional kind of ethic. But then I would also ask, would it be enough to rely on individual moral constraints? Your constraints, as a way of constructing the just city state. How do we do that? The second kind of, I think, important issue here is relevancy and political relevancy and motivation in relation to the things that we do. So there's an assumption here, and I think that Lori's one slide that you put up is pretty interesting, in her position that nothing is neutral, everything is political. And there's an assumption that everything is political in some way or another. I think that also Koolhaas in his argument at the beginning of the Fundamentals books makes that in a kind of oblique way when he talks about the way that what seem to be kind of or building elements that are non-politicized may become politicized or otherwise, depending on the way we construct their histories. Is it possible for architecture not to be politically motivated? If we accept the fact that it is all political in some level or another, is its production always motivated by politics? And I think I will kind of tip my hat here. I think that there is a difference between that which is produced with larger kind of political issues at stake, and that which is simply political as a result of its existence and its participation in the built world. So the third part was that all of, in relation to what Koolhaas puts out, publishes, and the way in which it is published as these kind of funny elements, the ramps, the toilets, the walls, windows, etc., and leaves off space, I think importantly. can all be interpreted in various kinds of ways as political agents. And he does in the book on ramps, he talks about, there's one place where he talks about the ramp as, in the 50s, I think, being understood and kind of promoted as a tool of equal access, of equality, of an element of architecture that is as important as the way in which we might think about the space in front of a abortion clinic, right? It has equal import and takes on meaning that we might not otherwise kind of recognize or understand. The other thing that Lawrence was talking about at the beginning was the role of capitalism in the way in which we understand what it is that we do, or the way that we don't understand it. I think is often part of the bigger issue. So the power of power in general, clients' preferences is what you talked about. Participating in a market economy and having the choice to do so or not. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. What Rem does at the beginning of the book is to talk about, what he says is that the market economy has eroded the moral status of architecture. It has divorced architecture from the public and pushed them, for architects, from the public and pushed them into the arms of the public sector. They do not serve you anymore, but it diffuse them. I think I'll stop there and I'll leave it open to discussion and questions.
So this is meant to be as open a discussion as possible with this arena model. The graduate students have prepared questions, and of course the audience is strongly encouraged to participate. So, should we start with the graduate student? The graduate student.
So looking back at history and Wiseman, who presents us with a quote on sovereignty. He says that if sovereignty is best understood as the power to calculate on behalf of others, then the evasion of its power is best exercised in making one's actions incalculable or immeasurable. So our question here is, within contemporary architecture, it can be argued that architects have established a certain degree of architectural sovereignty, in which their designs become commodities on a global scale. How can we move away from this perpetuation of architectural sovereignty, where architects are not solely in control of how architecture is conceived and digested?
Do away with the star system. I mean, I think the star system doesn't help our case at all. And in fact, when you think about architectural production, that the star is completely supported by a whole team of people, both in the office and on the construction site, for this project to happen. And I think it's a complete disservice to say and to associate a built work of architecture or an installation or what have you to one sole person. It doesn't work that way. Susanna Torre at this event I moderated last spring had said, you know, why can't architecture have awards like film, as an example, where they recognize every aspect of the process through an award system? I mean, I think we could question whether the award system is even necessary, but I thought her point was really valid, that by only singling out a handful of people globally, what does that do for architecture and for the built environment? I think what we provide is far more important than what 10 people, 5 people in the world are doing. So I think abolish the star system as one of the first things to undermine architectural production in a way that pushes it in a different direction?
To do away with star system, I think we have to change the economy first, because we are so willing to work for free. The American Pavilion at the Biennale organized, well, there was like a protest by Peggy Deemer and what was it, Architectural Lobby. They stood in front of the American Pavilion and protested that I don't know if they actually say we should unionize, but we should demand a good pay. We shouldn't work for free, and we shouldn't pull all-nighters. But we do it because we want to be a part of that architecture. At the same time, I'm guilty of working for free because our clients don't have money, but I believe they should have architecture. If we go along with this economic system we have now, that will never change. So I think that the problem is deep. I have no idea how to change it. That's why I asked that to you guys, to specifically come up with ways to get paid more, but make it for people who cannot pay, which is a conundrum, but I think we need to do it somehow.
So within the framework of David Harvey's architecture and beings, he distinguished between the worst architects from the best worker bee, and stating that the architects write structure in imagination before he erected it in reality. So while the status of worker bee is degraded under capitalist dogma. So my question is, operating within the capitalist system, which is based on the profit and competition. So in what capacity should programmatic use and occupation dictate architectural form with respect to the architects and developers?
Developers.
Can you say it in a different way, maybe? Use a mic, please.
So it's the programmatic use and the occupation
Of architecture should be
dictate to the architectural form.
as opposed to what?
So it's like, in what capacity should programmatic use and occupation dictate to the architectural form?
And why do you think those two are more important?
It's because maybe architectural form will change based on these two important parts, and the capitalist system will also affect them. So
I think one way to think about it is not necessarily, I think about it more as what kind of relationships create design work. And so whether in a capitalist system, if it's completely developer driven versus a system where architects work with developers, or where the community and the architects approach a developer with a project. So I think there can be other scenarios besides just a completely developer driven project, but that requires a pushback on the capitalist system. And it happens. I mean, the architecture firm Muff in London worked with a developer in Barking, East London, to rethink their public realm. And it was as a result of that collaboration that the design changed, the developer started to see a different way to approach the project, and other projects emerged. So I think you have to have a creative and clever architect, a willing client, and a willing developer to rethink or think differently about those relations within the current capitalist market that we have. So I clearly, in some cases that won't happen, but I think if you have people willing to rethink that relationship, there can be different products of architecture as a result.
I think it's an interesting question, and I think in many ways it sort of returns to Liz's provocation about developing a set of ethics, that I don't think that we can take what Harvey is saying so formulaically, right? He's not an architect. He's not even talking about the profession, that he's talking about the image of the architect, and he has a very idealized understanding of what the architect is capable of, about what architecture is, about what happens in the process of making architecture. But I think that if what we can find valuable about what he's saying is that he is at least cognizant of the kind of dance that that architects have to perform with power, with money, with developers, with a public whose face we might not even be able to imagine yet, and that I think these are questions that you will all have to sort of invent answers for yourselves. That there's no kind of strict formula of program to create some kind of oppositional architecture or to create some kind of space where we can imagine like a life outside of capitalism.
I wanted to continue this conversation around ethics that Liz brought up and Lawrence just elaborated on. The AIA Ethics Committee recently voted down a proposal for architects to not get involved in the design of certain correctional facilities, and write it into the code of ethics for architects not to be involved in those things, and it was voted down. My understanding of why it was voted down is really about the money that's involved in it, and because we're always operating under sometimes constrained positions and not really a profession that makes a lot of money in most cases, then we get these the star scenario is kind of attractive because that's kind of a way of selling out. But if selling out were like more universally available to us, I think more of us would sell out really easily. But is this idea of ethics something that is integral to architecture, or should it be integral to architecture?
I actually had a question that I've been trying to formulate, but thanks, Saku, that helps me. So in the interest of generating a cross atrium discussion, I wanted to sort of ask you what's at stake in abandoning or in retreating from this model of the starchitect. What might be lost in moving beyond that? And I'm asking you because it seems to me that one of the things that underlies this has to do with our understanding of the difference between ethics and aesthetics, and that I wonder if there's not a kind of, if there aren't sort of formal questions that are lost in moving beyond the idea of the starchitect. I'm not saying I'm like a supporter of any system, but I'm just kind of putting that out there. That maybe the idea of ethics, of the ethics of building our yes, okay, architects can afford to sort of turn down commissions to build correctional facilities, but is there not something valuable about, might there not be something valuable about a project like that, right? Is this also an aesthetic question?
So, yeah, I wanted to respond to that. I think that finding consensus is what, they were proposing to do, right? In other words, we don't, as a group, decide that we're going to build prisons. So one way you could look at it, I guess, is to say, prisons aren't so great, or I can make a better prison, right? I can participate in that and become part of a way to think about making maybe not a just city-state, but a more just city-state. But the other part of that is that I think it becomes really difficult to legislate how, as a profession, we operate in that context, because not everybody believes in the same thing. And so my moral code may be different from your moral code, and it is contextual. I think that's part of the bigger problem. And because we believe different things, because we have, different moral codes, because we come from different places, because there is really a diversity of opinion and political opinion as well, it's very difficult to legislate that you can't do something. Even though I may think that building prisons is not such a great thing to participate in personally.
Can I respond to it? Two things. I think ethics is always global. The modernity or enlightenment came out of partially, at least from colonization of Africa and Asia and South America. In contrast, Europe wanted to be civilized, and it was in negation to the savage culture of, colonies. That was certainly a part of it. So ethics is always in relation to the others. If that's the case, I think ethics is always global. Therefore, if we confine ethics in local, then we can't talk about the dynamics. So, for example, we can't say in America this happens, because there's so many parts of different Americas and different people live in it, but at the policy level, everybody makes policies about America and impressions about America, so we always have to look at global and local at the same time. Otherwise, we would always have to be, I don't know anything about America, but let me tell you about this part of America that I know, and we would never be able to have the same conversation. Therefore, the policies would be made without us, our input. Also, I think aesthetics is actually too ethical right now. It's too bound up in ethics. For example, so I'll try to be specific and not make it up, but in Africa, the first couple of images that I showed, they are aesthetic, and they show Africa in a particular way, and they're always accompanied with good West, poor Africa, and the aesthetics carry ethical message. And when, Architecture for Humanity or MAS or us build something there, it has to be nice, because it's unethical to build something ugly in Africa. Therefore, we can't never talk about ugly. We can't ever talk about just marks or lines or, the merit of art, because it's always with poverty, always with starvation. So to question aesthetics in any kind of politics, I think we have to divorce ethics and aesthetics first, and then rejoin them.
I want to follow up on your across the atrium question. And I think for me, one of the benefits, I see it definitely as a benefit, is first, your question assumes that only stars are the arbiters of form. I think that's clearly not true, not the case. There's many talented people in this building, in this city, in this country, and by having
They become stars.
maybe, maybe not, but I think part of abandoning the star system is that it enables a larger demographic of designers to be designing for society rather than a very, very narrow bandwidth. And I think that's incredibly problematic, and that there are different considerations by different constituencies, and we need designers that represent a multitude of constituencies in order to really design for our public and the various publics that are out there. So I think, why are these particular stars the people that have been deemed relevant, who have been deemed the aesthetes of our discipline? I think is incredibly, it's a question, it's a huge question, and I think it's problematic that there's such a star system of worship within the discipline.
Design at all level is sort of a commodity. There's a reason why we pay for more. We pay more for nicer shoes and nicer looking watches and an iPhone. So, if at the core we are designers and we are aesthetic people, why? Obviously, you know, besides the building not falling down so people don't die, why do we hold more responsibility, and why do we have to be more ethical, and why is that we can't just be designers who design commodity?
Who wants to touch that one?
So I'd like to sort of bring back what Mr. Cook said and the discussion about like the program maybe in response to what you're saying. Like, star architects have to design spaces, maybe like a small firm has to design spaces. The program is sort of arbitrary, but like maybe someone dies in a space or falls in love in a space or gets really sad in a space. Like, these are all things that sort of like are important to, I don't know, if someone passes dead in like Seattle Public Library, like what do you do? Like that, or like at home, like what's the difference? How does the architecture respond to that? And I think we do need to sort of divorce like ethics and aesthetics, because death is death no matter where, or something, I don't know, like something can happen in a space that's two separate spaces, but maybe it's the same field, I don't know.
I'm thinking about the system that we're operating in, and that definitely design is a commodity. But at least from where I sit, and I think Yutaka may agree with this, I'm not sure, if one of the aspirations is that everyone should be able to have design, how do we create a system, or how do we produce something that is not out of the reach financially for those who don't have as much money as those who do? And are there systems that we can create that would enable design to permeate a larger segment of the society? And I think about, there are crowdfunding projects that have happened that are smaller in scale. So the scale is yet to be, I think, successfully accomplished. But I think there are ways within the current structure that you can push back and still design the commodity, but how it gets funded and who's paying for it starts to change the way that operates. I think crowdfunding is a really interesting example of how that can happen. But I can't separate, I don't want to separate out what role we have in that and what role can we create to change that dynamic of us, because we are a service industry. So who are we serving and how are we serving them, for me, is a particularly important question. And at this point, you can't separate out the issue of capital and who's paying and how much are they paying. So are there ways to subvert that, or to think differently about funding streams in order to accomplish design for certain constituents who wouldn't have it otherwise?
Can I respond, please? Your argument sounds like similar to technology is neutral. It's the people who, like guns neutral, it's the people who kill, right? But guns are made to kill, right? It's we design to do something, and I don't understand how technology or design or engineering or urban planning can escape being at least a little bit responsible. So for example, Japan is struggling with radiation from nuclear power plants that exploded in Fukushima. And nuclear power plants, it's really neutral according to certain people, but it was put into a town that is depopulating, poor, aging, rural, and not getting much support from the central on purpose. And then it blew up, and Tokyo's fine, but they were making energy for Tokyo. Somebody designed that, right? So I don't think you can say technology or design is neutral.
I think you're shortchanging the commodity. Commodities are these magical things. I mean, yes, sure, you're just designing commodities, go for it. But those commodities are, think of it, they're these things that are made of real material, and yet they're things that people are willing to kill and die for. That they're these magical things that somehow come to be, they have a use value, they have exchange value, they have a value in the money economy. I think, yes, in a way, you're absolutely right. All you're doing is designing commodities, but I'd sort of encourage you to think more about what exactly is a commodity.
I find the argument about politics being about action, but I just wonder that isn't it more directed by the way you think, and isn't the system of pedagogy more responsible for your actions? Meaning, in the sense, instead of talking about the real world and real practice, which we seem to be talking about right now, real world implications, isn't it the responsibility of the system of pedagogy itself to develop a certain kind of thought? Meaning, I'm talking about every architect is educated in architecture in a certain school, meaning what he does in the real world is the responsibility of that school. Isn't there something more that maybe a school of architecture could do to alter the actions that we do in the real world? I mean, just putting the question.
Yes, absolutely. I hold the academy responsible, for sure. And I think for the discipline to change, the academy has to change. And I think we need to be pushing really hard, because it's not going to come from the top down, we see that, or it's going to be so glacially slow. And so I think talking about studio culture, talking about work-life balance, talking about or creating classes that are action-oriented, design-build studios, those things are happening, but I think it's also about scale of effort and getting other institutions involved, and that we aggregate together as an academy of architecture within North America, within and even globally. But yes, I totally agree with your point.
I don't. I think you're asking us to govern you. You're asking us to teach you the right way. I think that's wrong. I think we should have different opinions, and you should choose, and you should make coalitions, and you should start a movement, whatever that is, and don't ask us to govern you. But secondary point, practice influences how we teach here and how you learn. The reason why we slave in school is because we slave outside of school, and we are expected to when we graduate. So if that doesn't change, then this school doesn't change either. So I don't think those are separate.
Well, I would agree. Can I just want to respond to Yutaka? I agree with Yutaka, but I also think that there are lots of ways to practice, and we really can't tell you how to practice either. That has to do, the way that you practice and the decisions that you make about what you do, how you do it, whether you're designing a really nice watch or a nice pair of shoes, or you're making other choices, has to do with your own kind of moral conviction. If that, or your own financial ability to, reject jobs, if that's a question. This is all like back to the 60s or something, when there was emphasis placed on cooperative work, on understanding, urban design as being community generated and not coming from the top down. It's like going around again. We can't tell you what to do. We can construct diversity in the way in which we teach, in the way, in the kinds of problems that are brought to the school, but I don't think we can be dictators.
When I respond, briefly I would agree with you, Professor Kamell, and kind of clarify tangentially to you, Professor Sho. I think if design is this kind of like high up, top down structure, that as many inputs as you want to go into it will affect the output that comes out to the tangible ground level, not intending upon on the ground level of buildings, but the kind of output of the product is affected by how many things you want to put into it. So if it's a self-relevant, exclusively capital A architecture project, you're only putting in form and theory, et cetera, not with the intention of building, or that those inputs can be economics or government or the construction time, or and anything that you want to put in will affect the output of what comes out, I think. And I think that's inherent to any design discipline. But also I think it's interesting in the way that we teach school, and that's just how we're turning to your comment. Yes, it's our decision what we want to put in it. And I think it will just be an interesting framing if from maybe the beginning of freshman year or some point in the school they tell you that this is not a correct unilateral decision we're teaching you. This is our view on the input we put into the process. This is the process, this is how it works. You'll learn over time how it goes. But these are inputs, and you can put as many in as you want. You can take some out. You can kind of parametrically change that, up to you. But yeah, it's a kind of this loose structure that has, it's a relation from input to output, and that's kind of how we operate. I think that's kind of, would be better to explain that kind of loose concept, but then exactly leave it up to you, tell you what you want to put in, but just kind of diagram that relationship a little better and more clearly, because it's incredibly vague, I think, and you kind of end up realizing that one day, or maybe not.
Like, thinking in the context of overcoming capitalism, as you mentioned, I have two questions. First, or it's I guess a two-parter. Specifically, architecturally, what has the most potential to be subversive, whether it's form or program or something else? And then second, if community plus architect, as Professor Brown was mentioning, were to approach a developer with a project, and the developer is obviously going to demand to make a profit off of it, what is needed to overcome that profit and actually benefit the community rather than simply exploiting it?
I'm not, I don't think it's a question of overcoming capitalism. I think that if you sort of take what Harvey is saying in that reading as useful, then you really have to think about the sort of dance that, sorry, I'm not harping on this metaphorical dance, but if you think of this, these complex relationships that the architect is always embedded within, that you can't think of these as oppositional relationships of the community versus the developer, but that really your role in this is to somehow repivot that, to like reconfigure that oppositionality into something that's ethical.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I don't think they're in opposition. I've dealt with many corrupt community leaders, and I've had a fortune to work with government officials who are helpful. So it's rather, going back to Foucault's reading, it's rather what is controlling, what's ruling, what's the power that you are allowing to rule you, then how to break that pattern and join in the system so that it becomes a new system. So I don't think having that binary, whether you are designer or client, developer is always bad and theory is only within architecture, that doesn't, like, theory hasn't been more useful to me until I started building. And then I realized how important it was and how helpful it was to understand the location that we occupy in the world and how to articulate it and how to give meanings to our spaces and how to manipulate those meanings. Until we can put them in words, I don't think we can communicate with others and make it into space. So I agree that they're not binaries.
One last question.
Hi. Just to go full Phil Donahue on this, I'm going to present a kind of scenario rather than just a straightforward question. But let's say hypothetically, I'm an architecture student and I'm a Marxist. Completely hypothetical. So let's say I want to make activist architecture, and I've looked at all my precedents. Most of the time, they tend to be things that are cheap to build, easy to build, and it comes with a good sense of what are the politics of the space in which I'm dealing. That tends to be 9 times out of 10 activist architecture. Then I look at what I'm learning in school, and I don't really learn about politics in any of my survey or core classes. And I don't really learn about, well, not that kind of history. You wait for me.
You wait for yourself.
Me too. And on the other hand, yeah, sure, maybe we can draw wall details, but how many of us actually know how to put everything together? Once again, some people do it, but it's peripheral. And so it kind of gets to this other issue of like students that also don't really have much of a say in their means of production, that we sit there, we talk about the politics of education, but rather than being the petit bourgeois, which is what we are, you know, according to Marxist definitions, really we're kind of shackled in the sense that we're kind of told what to do, which is a problem we just kind of mentioned, and we kind of are expected to be told what to do, which is even more problematic, that we are feeding our own ideology. So the question I have is, what is it about the academy, what is it about the institution, and this isn't just Syracuse, that's so fundamentally not anti-political, but something that refuses to allow us to engage with things in a kind of socially progressive way? Because if you look at our canon, nothing in our canon is really that socially progressive. Maybe unité, maybe a confident, but that's about it. The thing is, our pedagogy is, I think, the product and the creator of a certain type of hegemony to which we respond. And, you know, I think that as students, the question is always not just what we do when we go out in the world and we start building, but what precisely are we doing now, and what way are we kind of being held back? Because at some point, all we really have to lose at this point, you know, considering we don't eat, we don't sleep, the only thing we have left to lose is our shackles.
Oh, can I respond to that just very briefly? I think this, you know, the university system as part of a much larger educational system breeds students who expect to be told what to do. And I think that that is fundamentally a really big problem. Second, and I will say no more about that, because you don't push back very much, right? And it's not, we don't expect for you not to push back, but you don't, right? But the second part of that, I think, is that we need to teach something. So what it is that you teach in 4 years, 5 years, or 3 years, whatever that is really limited. It's extremely limited. And there is an assumption that after those years, you will grow and become part of a profession, a society, in other ways, that you will use that knowledge, that fundamental knowledge, in ways that are appropriate, right? So if you want to get back to this idea of fundamentals, right, you seem to be arguing that politics is one of the things that we should be teaching, that it is that fundamental, that it becomes part of a kind of a larger curriculum. Maybe, and I would argue that if you really believe that, then it needs to be taught at a very early a very early stage in a really big in an educational system that's not just about the university. It's not just here.
We tried that in our seminar last 2 semesters ago, non-governmentality, and we tried to question home and field, lab and field that's set up outside and inside academia, right? Like, this is home, we know everything, we're gonna analyze whatever's outside. They're doing, whatever they're doing, but they don't know why. So we tried to question that home and field. Also, the rule of the classroom, and we are having a joint seminar with Michigan. So we would have this screen, and we would try to have a seminar, but the screen would govern us so that nobody could speak at the same time. It was very difficult to have a conversation. So we came up with this idea that, so what if we don't pretend that the room is not continuous, connected through the screen? What if we take what most of the chat room people do, which is to pretend that we are not who we are? So one day, I think he left, but one student wore a horse head and showed up, and it was a mess. They got really pissed. They were like, do you think you're making fun of us? Do you think this is funny? We are here to work. Can we talk about real stuff? And we're like, okay, we talked about, questioning the screen and the internet and how we can actually have a conversation, but we can't, so we're gonna be somebody. They were like, no, we are over that. We're not gonna do that, right? So, yes, we try to question, but it's really hard and it's really messy and it hurts, it's painful. So academia and the discipline has a long way to go, but we also have to understand the boundary and keep questioning it. So I don't have an answer. I'm just saying that it's really hard.
Very, very last comment. Very last. Okay. Lauren's going to respond, and then.
Oh, sorry.
Nathan.
No, go ahead. If it's to comment on, it goes on with the conversation. Please go.
Oh, so you don't have a question?
It goes on with the conversation, but please go.
I thank you. That's a great question, and it's an excellent provocation. And I think we sort of have to understand the history of the education in which we're embedded. That there are some really interesting idiosyncrasies about teaching in a school of architecture. It's a professional school. It's one of several professional schools in the university, but it's a kind of professional school that has, has within it these seeds of discontent, right? That it, so at the same time that you're being groomed to go into a profession that may or may not serve the interests of real estate developers, you're also being taught about socialist housing projects like Narcofen. And I think that in many ways, this is sort of the importance of critical thinking within the curriculum, right? That you're being taught about what are the sort of what are the kind of problems that are attendant within the kind of economy within which we're expected to function. So, like, if you think of the sort of demands that are placed upon you in architecture school that have been sort of in place since maybe the middle of the 19th century, that you're expected to work around the clock. This is how the rest of the economy has caught up with architecture in this sense, right? That there's no place in the academy now where like you're not expected to put in 26, 27-hour work days, and particularly for an assistant professor, this is the case. But but that what architecture has is this kind of very rich history to draw on, to think about. Well, we've already done this, and we've already figured out a way to move beyond that, or not. Or we've failed in trying to move beyond that. What can we now do? So I don't know. I think maybe the answer to the problem that Hamza is posing is more history classes.
Especially my class. Nathaniel.
Hi. Sorry. I guess to go on all three of those points, starting with Professor Kamell's, do we, as students, when we come in, it's like, I'm just speaking as a student, I don't pretend like I know anything for sure, any truth. I believe a lot in opinions. And when I came here first, it's like being babies. We're being brainwashed in many ways. But I don't think that it's the imposition of a professor's opinion onto our education that makes us I don't see it as an imposition, because I mean, at the end of the day, isn't that why the school makes us take different studio professors every semester, so that we enrich ourselves with as many opinions as possible, to then form our own and have our own voice by then expressing it in what we call thesis. But I guess I'm just asking a question that, like, we don't stay up, do we really believe that we stay all-nighters and pass so many hours at work because we have to, because our professor told us to? I mean, I've never seen it that way before. I think anybody would be kidding themselves if they were spending all those nights and all those hours doing something because a professor told them to. I think it still comes to original fire within us, which was what made us apply or made us go to such a high-achieving school, is that we have a passion for it and we have a hunger to create something, even if it is, at the end of the day, only a fictional project that is not within budget lines, not within budget restrictions, that is never going to be built, only an image, a section on a printed piece of paper to make us waste more money. But it's like, for me, I'm hearing this conversation and I'm so upset in a way, like I'm crying inside. It's like, am I really believing that I spent all those hours because someone told me to? God, no. It's like, I mean, it's like, but I think that's like, I believe in opinions, but I also believe that that's probably one of the only truths that can be said of any student who applies to architecture schools, that we do not know what we're about to get through, but if there's only one reason why we go through it, is because we know that we want to go through it as a sort of machism in a way. Like, yeah, it's like, we enjoy that pain, and thesis year is like, we finally get to talk.
Don't you find that's a problem?
Not really, because I've learned a whole lot. I mean, the problem to me is, like, again, like I came here as a kid, you know, like in my mind, my brain was a kid, and I'm just taking in everything from, and I'm not trying to praise the academy or all the faculty and staff here, but you are much wiser, more experienced people than we are, especially first year. So when we come in, we're just hungry to learn, but never have I ever heard a professor tell me you need to make 3 models. If I'm going to make 2, it's because I want to make 2. And you could, like, a lot of the time that's been called arrogance, but it's like, it's just will. It's not, it's a will to create and will to limit yourself, know your boundaries, what you want to create, how you want to create it, quality versus quantity and all that. And yeah, I mean, I'm so sorry.
No, I think one of the things you aren't acknowledging is that there's a structure in place that you take on. And I mean, I think it's incredibly problematic that it's okay to stay up nights to work on things. It's absurd. I mean, I'm a victim of that. I'm really trying not to do it. But there's a structure both from the practice and from the academy that enables this to continue. And for things to change, there has to be major shifts, major pushback, major agency within students, within faculty, within the profession to change it. So I think we're all culpable in this, and it's really disheartening to hear someone so buy into the myth of, oh, it's just because I want to work so hard. I mean, I think there's pressure. I think there's peer pressure. I think there's expectation at all levels, both through students, faculty, and professionals. That is just unsustainable. It's really unsustainable. It's not healthy, and there has to be ways to talk about it to change it. So, I mean, I admire passion, but I think it's in some ways a victim of the structure of what we do. And that has to change. I want that to change.
Well, we have a little cocktail party. Always a crowd pleaser.